The second epistle to the Corinthians, often referred to as 2 Corinthians, is the 8th book of the New Testament of the Bible. Paul the Apostle and Timothy our brother, wrote this epistle to the Church of God which is at Corinth, with all the saints which are in all Achaia. 2 Cor. 1:1. Composition. While there is little doubt among scholars that Paul is the author, there is discussion over whether the epistle was originally one letter or composed from two or more of Paul's letters. Although the New Testament only contains 2 letters to the Corinthians, the evidence from the letters themselves is that he wrote at least 4. 1 Cor 5-9 refers to an early letter, sometimes called the warning letter. 1 Corinthians, the severe letter. Paul refers to an earlier letter of tears in 2 Corinthians chapter 2 verses 3-4 and 7-8. 1 Corinthians does not match that description, so this letter of tears may have been written between 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians. 2 Corinthians. The abrupt change of tone from being previously harmonious to bitterly reproachful in 2 Corinthians chapters 10-13 has led many to speculate that chapters 10-13 form part of the letter of tears, which were in some way tagged onto Paul's main letter. Those who disagree with this assessment usually say that the letter of tears is no longer extant. Some scholars also find fragments of the warning letter, or of other letters, in chapters 1-9. For instance, that part of the warning letter is preserved in 2 Cor 6:14-7-1, but these hypotheses are less popular. Structure. The book is usually divided as follows. 1-1-11 Greeting. 1:12-7:16 Paul defends his actions and apostleship, affirming his affection for the Corinthians. 8-1-9-15 Instructions for the collection for the poor in the Jerusalem church. 10-1-13-10 A polemic defense of his apostleship. 13-11-13 Closing greetings. Background. Paul's contacts with the Corinthian church can be reconstructed as follows. Paul visits Corinth for the first time, spending about 18 months there. He then leaves Corinth and spends about 3 years in Ephesus. Paul writes the warning letter in his first year from Ephesus. Paul writes 1 Corinthians from his second year at Ephesus. Paul visits the Corinthian church a second time, as he indicated he would in 1 Corinthians chapter 16 verse 6, probably during his last year in Ephesus. 2 Corinthians chapter 2 verse 1 calls this a painful visit. Paul writes the letter of tears. Paul writes 2 Corinthians, indicating his desire to visit the Corinthian church a third time. The letter doesn't indicate where he is writing from, but it is usually dated after Paul left Ephesus for Macedonia, from either Philippi or Thessalonica in Macedonia. Paul presumably made the third visit after writing 2 Corinthians, because Acts chapter 20 verses 2-3 indicates he spent 3 months in Greece. In his letter to Rome, written at this time, he sent salutations from some of the principal members of the church to the Romans. Content. In Paul's second letter to the Corinthians, he again refers to himself as an apostle of Christ Jesus by the will of God and reassures the people of Corinth will not have another painful visit. But what he has to say is not to cause pain but to reassure them of the love he has for them. It was shorter in length in comparison to the first and a little confusing if the reader is unaware of the social, religious, and economic situation of the community. Paul felt the situation in Corinth was still complicated and felt attacked. Some challenged his authority as an apostle and compares the level of difficulty to other cities he has visited who had embraced it. Like the Galatians, he is criticized for the way he speaks and writes, and finds it just to defend himself with some of his important teachings. He states the importance of forgiving others, and God's new agreement that comes from the Spirit of the living God, and the importance of being a person of Christ and giving generously to God's people in Jerusalem, and ends with his own experience of how God changed his life. Uniqueness. Easton's Bible Dictionary writes, "This epistle, it has been well said, shows the individuality of the apostle more than any other. Human weakness, spiritual strength, the deepest tenderness of affection, wounded feeling, sternness, irony, rebuke, impassioned self-vindication, humility, a just self-respect, zeal for the welfare of the weak and suffering, as well as for the progress of the Church of Christ and for the spiritual advancement of its members, are all displayed in turn in the course of his appeal." Lias, 2 Corinthians. Scholars: George H. Guthrie, professor at Union University in Jackson, Tennessee. Larry Wellborn, professor at Fordham University in the Bronx, New York.